on this computer. Beautiful. I was so excited last week that Zoom was working and I could see people that I forgot to record. Okay, we'll get rolling, everybody. So happy Tuesday. Hope you're all doing well. As I mentioned, I'm coming to you from a different location today for logistical purposes, but seems like the internet's doing okay. Seems like all's good. So today we're going to go over primarily ADHD stuff. We're going to talk about intellectual disability. Those are the two main things we're going to talk about. I'm going to share with you one of these psychological assessments that my colleague, Dr. Mary Jo Rooney, completed, which will hopefully be pretty cool. Something I typically do in face-to-face courses, but I'm trying to figure out how to do it securely. So I'm going to take a stab at it today. But before that, let's talk about the exam briefly. We have an exam that's going to open on Thursday. Okay, so I'll probably have it open like Thursday at 12 a.m. So like when Thursday starts, and I'll have it open through Sunday night, 11:55 p.m. Okay, and I'll put all this in an announcement when I announce that the exam's open. So it'll be open for a few days. You can take it one time, but you can use your book and other resources. That's totally fine. I made the exam this past weekend. It's 50 questions, multiple choice, true and false. Again, it's pretty much stuff that we've covered in class. There's a lot of stuff about the 4 Fs. So just a lot of like, which 4 Fs, which of the 4 Fs is this with some sort of situation? What is this F of the 4 Fs? What you kind of define this one? So there's a lot of that 4 F stuff in relation to some of the diagnoses we've been talking about. Only 3 diagnoses on the test are autism, ADHD, and intellectual disability, okay? And we're going to review those last 2 today in relation to important things, but things that are on the exam. So I do have a Kahoot that I made. I provided that link. If anyone has tried it and it went successfully, can you please say it in the chat or say it aloud that it worked? It's the first time that I share a Kahoot that way. My intention is that hopefully you can open up the link and take a little practice exam. It's 13 questions long. It very much mimics some of the exam questions and the content of them. The questions are just a lot shorter because I only have so many characters to ask a Kahoot question. So, it's just a little bit shorter. They're condensed questions, but about the same kind of style and kind of same content. So if you want to review, take that Kahoot for sure. And then I will highlight some things in our lecture today that will be on the exam, okay? I'll drop some hints to you. I appreciate you guys joining the lecture live and all that. So I think that's everything about the exam. Does anyone have any questions? You can speak up now or send them in chat if you do. One more quick thing about the course. There was one yellow dig question that I thought was worth mentioning that came from a student this week. The student was kind of inquiring. They're a little bit behind on their points. And when they look at my participation, they're a little bit behind in their points kind of week to week. So they were wondering, what can they do to make up those points? And keep in mind that you can earn 750 extra points per week in Yellow Dig. Some of you are definitely doing that, and those points just keep rolling over. So if you are earning 3,750 points per week, then you're accumulating extra points that just tack onto your score, right? So some of you who are earning those amounts week after week, like, you can take a week off here in a few weeks if you wanted to, because you're going to have plenty of points. Or if you have a bad week and you just don't feel like yellow digging, which I can't imagine you wouldn't want to yellow dig. But if that were the case, then you could take a week off. So, but for people who need to make up those points, because you had a bad week or whatever, then you can make up those points by getting those extra points that just continue to carry over. Okay, some of you have probably realized if you've been getting 3,750 points per week, that when you start the week, it may say that you've earned 0 points, but you've completed 60% of the points, right? Like why is that? Well, that's because you have rollover points and you have 60% of the points from that week from all your rollover points. All right. Thank you very much for the chat, everybody, and responding to people asking questions. Yes, that's correct. It's going to open Thursday, first thing on Thursday through Sunday, 11:55 p.m. So it'll be up there in that time. So you have a few days to take it. Okay. If you have any questions, though, continue to ask them here in chat, or you can email me. All right. Very exciting. Today, let's jump right into some of the content. We're going to start talking about ADHD. And then we're going to talk about some intellectual disability stuff, IQ stuff. And then I'm going to hopefully share with you a brief psychological evaluation. I'll kind of verbalize it for you, and then we can go from there. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Well, oops, okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about ADHD first. I'm going to make the screen large here, and then I'll take a break and ask for questions afterwards. So I'll go back to those things here in a minute, but just some important components of ADHD I want everyone to be aware of. ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I always get the acronym messed up, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. I've talked about some of these things, or I think last class, but these symptoms, the symptoms that we'll talk about here, they have to be present in someone before the age of 12. Again, this diagnosis is in that grouping of neurodevelopmental disorders, right? Autism, IQ, disability, intellectual disability, and ADHD are all grouped in neurodevelopmental disorders. So there needs to be some component of it early in life. About 5% of children carry the diagnosis, about 2.5% of adults. There is a significant amount of adolescents who will carry the diagnosis into adulthood. So, and I have worked with adults and seen everybody who truly suffered from ADHD and did not get proper diagnosis or treatment when they were kids. I'm going to share one brief story about that. I was working with a man one time, and he came into my office, and I'm talking to him and kind of getting his history and kind of what's going on a bit and trying to piece things together. He's describing a lot of symptoms related to ADHD. He's talking about how difficult it is for him to focus on his work. He did a pretty labor-intensive job, and he was responsible for people, and so he was very afraid of making mistakes and someone getting hurt. He had a really hard time completing associated paperwork. He was really struggling. And what he told me at one point during our discussion was that he was drinking about 120 ounces of caffeinated beverages a day. 120 ounces. That's a lot. That's a lot of beverages, caffeinated beverages. Okay. But some of you may be putting the pieces together here a bit. So the typical medication for ADHD is a stimulant, right? It is a stimulant. It's kind of a weird thing because stimulants make our nervous system and our mind go faster, but they actually help slow down the mind and slow down the body of someone with legitimate ADHD. So typically for medication, we give stimulants, Adderall, methylphenidate, Vyvanse, different types of stimulants. There are non-stimulants now too. Caffeine is a stimulant, right? So this man was drinking 120 ounces or so of caffeine a day. He was trying to self-medicate and he didn't know it. So I straight up told him, I told him, or maybe I thought it in my head, I can't remember now, but I was thinking to myself, I'm really glad you never tried cocaine, because that would have been awful. Because it probably would have made him feel really good, in a different type of way, than it might make other people feel good. But don't do cocaine. So that's just one example. This man was really, really struggling, and I truly believe, after getting a history from him, that he was an athletic star in the small town that he was raised. And I don't know much about his family life, but I don't know how much really intervention he really received throughout his life. And in his adult life, he was really, really struggling because of it. So, big thing about ADHD: symptoms need to be present in more than one environment. So it can't just be school. Okay. So if a teacher or someone is saying that, a child has ADHD because they can't pay attention in class, these symptoms that we're going to talk about also need to be present in another environment, like home or other places. ADHD is not something that turns off and on when there's schoolwork. Okay. But at the same time, a lot of times it is first identified in school, because kids go to kindergarten, first grade, so on and so forth, and they're asked to sit in a seat, pay attention, follow story time, listen to a teacher. Whereas home, even if it's a structured home, it may be a little bit more lax. So another big thing that may or may not be on the exam: males are diagnosed with ADHD twice as often as females. It's probably that probably is a legitimate thing, that males probably do carry it a bit more, but we also know that males are diagnosed more with externalizing disorders like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, so on and so forth, and less so with internalizing disorders such as depression and anxiety. And I have worked in schools before where I have observed girls who they were exhibiting symptoms of ADHD, but they were undiagnosed. A lot of times girls who have ADHD get labeled as overly social, or kind of flighty, or all these things that we kind of stereotypically may think, but they may actually be struggling with something that's just not those things. So the hyperactivity does change through adolescence. I believe this is on the exam as well. In adolescence, kids may not be climbing all over tables and chairs and things like that, but they may be very restless. They may have a very internal kind of energy that they are struggling with. And so it may be a little bit more internalized in some way, but it may not look the same. So, okay, just some general things about ADHD there. So these are the symptoms. Sorry, my computer got backed up there. So there are two modes of ADHD. I'll say. Actually, I want to share something with you here. New share. I can do that. That's nice. There are two modes of ADHD. There are inattention and hyperactivity. You can be diagnosed with either. Oh, this is great. I can see the chat and I'm sharing. This is fantastic. So this is the DSM, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And these are the diagnostic criteria for, this is inattention, as you can see right here. And then this down here is hyperactivity. So with ADHD, really important, you can have ADHD predominantly inattentive type. You can have ADHD predominantly hyperactivity or impulsivity type, or you can have ADHD combined type, which means that there's both inattention and hyperactivity. So it's possible that someone displays these inattentiveness symptoms without hyperactivity, or vice versa. Many times they display both. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint because you don't have to copy down all that DSM stuff because that's just a lot. So these are essentially the inattentive symptoms distilled down. I love that picture. Um, uh, Essentially, as you can see, the trend of them, everybody, is that there is notable um, challenges with paying attention. There are 9 symptoms. You need 6 of them to meet criteria. There are 9 symptoms. You need 6 of them to meet criteria for the inattentive piece. There's also 9 symptoms in hyperactivity, and you need 6 of them to meet criteria. And when I say criteria, again, that refers to the criteria required to meet the threshold to receive a psychological diagnosis. But here we have, again, I mean, most of them are pretty self-explanatory. I've definitely worked with a lot of people who I do think have legitimate ADHD, and there's a tendency to lose things. I had one young man in middle school who went through probably 4 or 5 school IDs, just really, really forgetful, misplacing things, disorganization, keeping, I know a lot of things are electronic now, but if there's any sort of papers or things like that, their backpacks just tend to look like a tornado of things. General distractedness. I really like just sitting down with young people who may have ADHD in my office, because my office has a lot of stuff in it. This is not my office, by the way. My office has a lot of stuff in it. There's a lot of games and toys and just a lot of stuff. It's very, very stimulating. So if you have ADHD, it's very difficult to pay attention in my office because there's a lot of stuff going on. So, and more often than not, if someone's significantly struggling with ADHD, they'll sit down in my office, and before I know it, they are, oh, what's this and what's that, and we're kind of half talking, but they're playing with stuff, and it can be very difficult to get them on task. Sometimes they'll just stand up and they'll go away for a little while, and they'll kind of come back, and but again, that's not evidence that they definitely have ADHD, because it's one environment. But it definitely, if I get a good history and do a full evaluation, then it definitely supports that diagnosis. So I'll tell you, one of the things with young people in schools is that the electronic stuff that schools are going to, that all schools are with now, with Power School and tablets and all that stuff, it is like a nightmare for parents of kids who have ADHD, because it is so hard for parents to actually track all their kids' stuff electronically, because most of them are not digital natives. And 2, even if they are, it can be really hard to decode. So it can be tough. Inattention, love this picture too. Great picture. These are the hyperactivity symptoms. So again, if you look throughout all of them, you can really see a main pattern of hyperactivity, right? I usually ask questions to parents such as like, what's it like when you have to wait in line with your child for, fast food or an ice cream or something like that? What do they like when you guys sit down if you guys sit down and you try to eat dinner together? What is that experience like? And oftentimes parents will say things like, well, yeah, he's just like sitting on the edge of his chair, and like at the first, he just gets up and he goes. So in class, sometimes in schools, blurting out answers, interrupting people, different adults can report that for sure. That adult male that I was working with, obviously his hyperactivity is going to look different than other people's. He was a fidgeter for sure. I mean, he was like, doing stuff, and just a big kind of internal energy, right? But adults, of course, have the presence of mind that, I have to do something with this energy. I can't, be climbing all over tables and things like that. In terms of inattentiveness with that adult male, he shared how he would start projects all over his house and never finish them, right? So kind of that attention to detail, attention with following through, almost like in high school, where I'm sure he would start homework assignments and never finish them, turn them in, lose them, so on and so forth, right? So we're seeing this, this pattern of this inability to complete work because they get distracted and they don't follow through and they can't, so on and so forth. So hyperactivity and inattentiveness. So I say, you've heard me say a couple of times here, with regards to ADHD, you've heard me say a couple of times, legitimate ADHD, because as I kind of posted about on Yellow Dig for my post this week, posted about how, ADHD, there does seem to be research evidence that it is largely overdiagnosed. And in my experience as a practitioner working in schools and working privately, there's definitely a tendency for people to say, if a kid's not paying attention in school or is fidgety or is whatever, they jump to ADHD because he's hyperactive. And we know that hyperactivity is a symptom of ADHD, so that's what it is. But that is just not always the case. It's just not always the case. So one of the reasons for that, and the research that, they kind of talk about is, or they research is, the medications for ADHD, the stimulants and the non-stimulants, they can be very, very, very effective. So even if a child sometimes doesn't have ADHD, but they're dealing with something else like trauma, a ADHD medication can often subdue some of the ADHD symptoms. So there's almost this kind of confirmation bias where a child gets on medication for ADHD, they stop having these symptoms, and then they definitely have ADHD, whereas there may be other stuff going on. Now, in terms of treating ADHD, research also says that the best thing in generally speaking, the best outcomes do come from a combination of therapy and medication. And I've witnessed that in my practice too, where if you have a young person who's really struggling with ADHD symptoms, then medication can really help, combined with helping the guardians and helping the child understand kind of organizational things, kind of routine patterns, structure, behavioral reinforcement stuff can all help with helping them. But I really always advocate that, any guardian that has their child on medication for ADHD or anything else, or an adult on medications, that they really have a medication provider who they really trust, and they do regular checkups. And, there are certainly times where we can maybe try to get off of that ADHD medication if we're developing skills and we're trying, and that it may be the case. It may not be, but it may be the case where we may be able to titrate off of that medication at some point to try to be helpful, because we can learn skills to compensate. So, yeah. So I think that's pretty much what I have to say about ADHD. So I have the chat box up. I don't see any questions. But I do have that chat box up, so please feel free to send me any questions that you have. Let me check the time. Oh, we're doing great. We're doing great. I want to talk briefly about intellectual disability now, and then I'm going to read to you parts of an assessment that my colleague completed. Okay, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about the nature of intelligence, and we're going to talk a bit about intelligence in general. Intelligence testing is something that I knew almost nothing about before I started graduate school. Then I started graduate school and I took this huge class in intelligence testing. That was like 6 credits. There's a lot of time, a lot of work, and you practice how to provide intelligence testing and I can do that now if I want to, but I have not done actual intelligence testing for a long time because it's not really in my practice area. Something I do want to get back to because I do like the structure of it. But I interpret a lot of intelligence tests because I read a lot of assessments and I do a lot of diagnostic assessments, which intelligence can be an important part of. So intelligence tests are not something that you can find online, even if they say that they are. Intelligence tests are something that are researched for years and years and years before they are published, and only licensed people can buy them. It's actually a pretty secure thing. We have a lot of them in our department, in the psychology department, and they're definitely kept under lock and key. And they, as a profession, we really try to keep these internal, so to speak. But just to give you an example, so the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WACE, or the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Adults, it's in its fifth edition. Well, the WISC is in its fifth edition. The one for children, the WACE, is still in its fourth, and it's been around for like 100 years. So there's a lot of testing that goes into these things. The tests are very standardized, so that means that whether you take an intelligence test from me or you take it from someone in Wisconsin, that the testing procedures are going to be exactly the same. My friend and colleague, Kate Hashke, who some of you may know, she's receiving her PhD now in a school in Virginia, but she taught here last year. And she taught the appraisal of children class, the intelligence testing class, through the graduate students last year, and she had memorized like the first 3 paragraphs of the test, where she could just verbatim say everything, because you have to read it. Everything is standardized. Things should be very uniform, so we're all delivering the same test. This plays into the reliability of the test. We want the test to be reliable in terms of the scores that someone gets should be consistent. So whether Johnny takes the test in, sorry, Johnny, you're on my screen, whether Johnny takes the test in Kansas or Wisconsin, you should get the same test score, Johnny, whether you're doing it with me or doing it with somebody else. Shouldn't change a whole lot. And IQ is very, very stable. Typically speaking, IQ doesn't change a whole lot throughout life. Typically speaking, there are some notable exceptions to that. For instance, if you're an extraordinarily bright person, maybe you have an IQ of 140 or 130 or whatever, but you are in a very impoverished educational system, then the brain can essentially, your IQ can essentially atrophy, and you can become, your IQ score can lower to a degree. If you get some sort of brain trauma, then of course your IQ score could lower to a degree. If my memory goes out the window, then that's going to impact my IQ score, my working memory. Tests should also be valid. This is the hardest thing with intelligence. The hardest thing. This is the holy grail of intelligence, everybody, because if you get a high score on an intelligence test, what the heck does that mean, right? Well, as in America, we are just wedded to intelligence tests. Essentially, if you get a score of 130, 140, then you should be a success in life, whatever that means. But that's just not true. So I'm actually going to jump ahead a little bit. Okay, to Terman's termites. So Terman's termites. Terman was a famous psychologist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He taught at Stanford, which is one of the most prestigious schools in the country, and has one of the most prestigious psychology departments in the country. And Terman was obsessed with intelligence. He really wanted intelligence to be a tool to help identify people who needed it, and help accelerate the people who scored very highly. So he identified, I think it was 1,600 children around the age of 12 who had an IQ score of, I believe, of 130 or above. He helped redesign the Stanford Binet, which is an intelligence test. That is still I'd say one of the top 2 or 3 intelligence tests today. He helped to revise it back in the early 1900s. And then they kind of captured these kids, so to speak, in the sense of like following them throughout their lives, and did a long-term study. And Terman, of course, he had a lot invested in IQ, so he, of course, touted the big victories and said, like, these kids are amazing, because of their IQ and everything. They are just, this is all that happens to them. But on further look, unfortunately, that really wasn't quite the case. In fact, if you look at the distribution of their achievements and things that they've done, it really wasn't any different than any other selection of 1,600 kids. So you could take any 1,600 kids, and about what they achieved or they didn't achieve was about uniform. There were people who did do really well, and there were people of those 1,600 kids whose lives were very, very, very difficult and very, very sad. So, and everything in between. So there really wasn't much to actually come out of that. So what we want, though, with IQ, generally speaking, is it to be valid. How can we predict that if you do well on this test? What does that mean? So it's kind of the holy grail of intelligence testing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. This is the WISC. I'm not going to test you on this, everybody, so you don't feel like you gotta. This is just for your own curiosity, okay? I just wanted to give you a taste of kind of what intelligence tests kind of are. Lots of research goes behind, and they were standardized on 2,200 kids, representative of the U.S. population, because we in a perfect test, we don't want things like culture or the area that you live to be a factor. We want a pure measure of intelligence. Intelligence tests are not filled with questions like who was the 30th president of the United States, because that's crystal knowledge, right? It's more about fluid intelligence, where how do you reason? How do you look at things? What do you see? It's kind of like, in some ways, kind of like the ACTs that you guys take, in the sense of they're trying to get more at your aptitude, less so about whether this calculus equation. So these are the general kind of subtests or on the test. These aren't all of them, but we'll look at a block design here in a minute. But just some general kind of different sorts of tests they have on the test. So digit span, for instance, is just rattling off a bunch of numbers to you and seeing how much you can remember of them. So it starts with 4 numbers, goes to 5 numbers, 6 numbers, 7 numbers, 8 numbers, and you just see how far you can go, essentially, before you can't. This is an example here of block design. This is from the WACE, actually. This is not from the WISC. This is the adult version, right? So which 3 of these pieces go together to make this puzzle? I'm sorry, this is not block design. This is, visual puzzles right at the top. Thank you. It's not block design, but which 3 of these pieces go together to make this puzzle? So, and I haven't looked at this for like over a year, and I'm not going to put myself on the spot, so I don't know off the top of my head. But these are the type of questions that the test is going to ask you to think about things. So we put all these things together, and it eventually kind of pops out a total IQ score. But this is very important. In the DSM, we do not diagnose someone with intellectual disability just because they have a low IQ score. That is a major part of it. But in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition 5, we need other domains of intellectual disability as well, that are these here. So the person who may be cognitively lower functioning or have an intellectual disability, they also need to display challenges in conceptual, social, and practical knowledge. So things like academic knowledge, right? Even though we have an IQ test, but what is their academic knowledge like? What, generally speaking, how do they do in school? How do they do with that more kind of crystallized knowledge? Social skills. how do they interact, generally speaking? Can they communicate well? Things like that. So I think I mentioned last time, one of the things that is a concern with people with an intellectual disability is, can they kind of read people's intentions? Can they understand when someone may be taking advantage of them, if someone might be conning them, or not? How are they able to interact in general? And then practical knowledge, money management, activities of daily living. I worked with one young man who the financial piece was a really, really big thing for him. The second, he would get any money, he's essentially spending it on pop and snacks and video games, and has very, very, very little understanding of like the meaning of money, and spending other people's money too. I think he spent like $600 one day on Xbox stuff on his mom's credit card, and mom wasn't so happy about that. But he didn't really have a good understanding, so to speak, as to like the consequences of that. And I don't mean the consequences for him, like mom got mad. I mean like that, that's $600 that mom earned, and that she is blah, 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 and kind of that whole kind of consequential piece. So there has to be challenges in these areas. There really has to be. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Okay. I'm going to share with you now. I'm not going to put it on the screen for kind of security purposes, but I'm going to put my face on the screen, which you're probably not excited to see either, but I'm going to put that on the screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to share a little bit of not all of it, because I don't want to bore you to death, but I am going to share pieces of a full psychological evaluation that my colleague did on a 75-year-old man, I think it was, who had ID. Okay, just to give you kind of an idea of some different things. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Great to see everyone again. I'm going to pull up my, oh, great question. We're going to answer this question first from Levi. Thank you, Levi. Levi asks, how closely related is Asperger's and ADHD? Wonderful question. Okay. There is a really high incidence of ADHD in people who are on the autism spectrum, or, what was formerly known as Asperger's. So Asperger's used to be in the DSM. Now it's no longer in the DSM. It's just an autism spectrum now. Asperger's is no longer there. Okay. Thanks for bringing that up, actually, Levi. That's a really important point. But Asperger's was essentially a lighter form of autism, but they just put that all on a spectrum now, calling it autism spectrum. Anyway, there's a really high incidence of ADHD in autism. I think it's like something like 40-something% of kids on the spectrum also have a co-diagnosis of ADHD. But here's the thing: some of you may be thinking like, well, why is that? I think it's very legitimate, but I also work in situations where it can be hard to discern whether a child is just so interested in their own interest and in their own mind, and if they're in their own world with autism, versus inattentiveness, right? So if school is just so effing boring, okay, and I am just obsessed with thinking about Maytag washers and planning and drawing and planning out what I'm going to do that night to take apart my washer and put it back together and understand how spring A201 relates to spring A409, right? Why would I be paying attention in school? Okay. Or if I just get in my own head, period, and I'm just interested in other things, or I'm nonverbal or not very verbal, and I don't respond in a typical way, it could be mistaken for inattentiveness, and then we go down the ADHD path. I have worked with people who definitely have autism, but they were diagnosed with ADHD when they were like, 6 or 7. Not saying they don't have ADHD, but you know, we've been on stimulants now for 4 years or 5 years, and it's kind of like really hard to tell whether it was just autism or if it is ADHD and autism, or maybe just ADHD. So really good question. You do see those things, and it is hard to kind of parse out. Okay, let's get to the assessment. All right, everyone, this assessment was on, and now keep in mind, everything is really de-identified, okay? So like everything I'm telling you has been changed around, warped to really, I don't even remember what the guy's name actually is and all that, okay? So I call him Sean. So again, pretty much everything has changed, but the nature, the essence of it is still there. So I'm just going to read to you a brief history about Sean, only about a paragraph, okay, a couple paragraphs, and then I'm going to jump down to a couple of things. I'm going to show you his IQ scores, and then I'm going to read to you kind of some of her conclusions, okay? So just hang with me. We're going to see how this goes. So Sean is a 70-year-old male who was brought to testing by his guardian. So people who do have an intellectual disability and they're over the age of 18, they can have a legal guardian, which is essentially almost like a parent in the sense of they can make medical decisions about that person. You guys all in this class probably don't have a legal guardian, in the sense of like, if you can take yourself out of the hospital, or you can do this, or you can do that, or you can, you have a lot of rights as adults. But Sean has a guardian who can help make medical decisions for him. Sean is in need of an assessment to see if he will qualify for more services. Reportedly, Sean was pulled out of school in the second grade. Pulled out of school in the second grade when his mother found out that school was mistreating him, including placing him in the basement with no attempt at education. He's a 75-year-old man. He lived at home with his parents and his brother. His father passed away in the 60s due to a farming accident. Sean would have been in his 20s at that time. He continued to live with his mother, and they moved to Atwood, Kansas. Not the actual place. He worked at a meatpacking plant. After his mother passed away, there was a person in Atwood who served as his guardian. At some point, the packing plant shut down. Then he helped out different farmers with heavy jobs and doing some odd jobs. His current guardian has helped since 2014. He helps with bills and helps Sean pay the bills and get groceries and things like that. I'm kind of paraphrasing some things here. Sean now mows lawns for money. He has a driver's license, which allows him to drive, but he sometimes gets lost. Okay. Now I'm going to show you, so I'm going to show you a couple of things. Sean took what's called a receptive vocabulary test, which is meant, as my colleague, sorry, I'm in an office. Sean took a receptive vocabulary test, which, as my colleague describes it, is a test to really just try to probe what kind of vocabulary you have. It shows you a picture and it asks you what it is, okay? But it's standardized, it's reliable, and all those types of things. So on this measure, he achieved a standard score of 44, which is at the 0.1 percentile level. It corresponds to a 3.5-year-old in terms of a score. Okay, but she really talks about here how this is probably due to Sean's lack of education. If you get pulled out of school in the second grade, you're going to have a really, 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 really poor vocabulary, okay, especially if you have a lower cognitive functioning. But I just wanted to share that, okay? Now I'm going to share this so you can see this. Just his scores, there's nothing. So these are his scores listed out. So you can see that this is the waist right here. Again, and this is important. I think there's a question about this on the exam maybe, but scores are standardized on a curve, right? And so 100 is average. 100 is average, which means that a 58 for verbal comprehension would be extremely low. So you can see that the official qualitative description of all of his scores are extremely low. He had a full scale IQ of 52, okay, which almost puts him in moderate cognitive functioning disability. Okay? We can see on his subscales here that really, really low too, right? I think the scaled score max is 10 on each one, and he got 1s and 4s and 2s. He got a 7 there. That was pretty good. Okay. So go back to me. So those are Sean's scores. Now this is the important part, okay? So remember those 3 domains of cognitive functioning. Sean's life skills were evaluated. He is able to engage in communication if the person is patient with listening and trying to figure out what he is saying. He can communicate what he wants to do. He can explain a task, and he can tell a funny story. He can listen and respond appropriately if the communication is carefully done. He can show interest in others and laugh at appropriate moments in a story told by others. He can add information to a conversation, which indicates that he is listening. Following the conversation, and understanding the basics of what is being said. His English and grammar are rudimentary, but sufficient for basic communication. His tenses and use of person, I, me, he, his are often incorrect. He's able to navigate in a small community. It would be easy to take advantage of him because of his inability to make change or completely understand a complex request. He has almost no academic abilities, with the exception of he can tell time on a clock with his hands. With hands, sorry. He cannot read or do math, but in practical terms, he knows what numbers represent. He can count objects up to 10 and had a good strategy covering the ones that he had already used to make sure that he was correct. His home living skills are better in that he can use a hamper, put things in their proper place, sweep the floor, and knows to take off or wipe dirty shoes before entering the house. He prepares simple meals, takes out the trash, and uses a washing machine. He does have some help with cleaning. He has single digits in his phone linked to people, so he has to remember one number to call them, like a speed dial. He manages his own medications with labels and bottles. He has not been, that's not important. Let's see. He does very little for leisurely activities, plays a simple card game, or listens to music. Sean works best with clear direction. He can work on tasks until they are complete. He does have some issues at time managing his emotions when he is frustrated or mad. Okay, very, very lastly. So she didn't end up diagnosing him with an intellectual disability, moderate, which is, so you have mild, moderate, and severe. So he's right in the middle there, which is significant. She lists a lot of recommendations, so just a couple of them I thought were insightful. Sean has his license, which she's concerned about. He's driving around his town. So she talked about in one of her recommendations that it's really beyond the scope whether within this assessment whether Sean should be able to drive or not, but that this might be evaluated by somebody else. If he does drive, he should carry some sort of placard or note, which would help a police person understand if he got pulled over, because we could see how that could go wrong pretty quickly. And if he can have something to show a police officer, then that would be helpful. Managing money, stuff like that. But that's kind of the long and short of this assessment that she did for Sean. I didn't show you everything in here. There's quite a bit more. It's 6 pages long, single spaced. But I'll probably share more with you somehow. Hopefully this worked okay, and it wasn't too boring without you being able to see it. But this is an example of a very, very, very good psychological assessment. You could tell how detailed my colleague was in terms of really what are those conceptual, practical, and social dynamics around Sean. And because she did all that plus his IQ score, she was really able to confirm that he does indeed have an intellectual disability, and this is why. Okay, I see no more questions. I went through things way faster today than I thought I was going to, which is okay. I feel like I went pretty fast. I don't have a prompt for us today to kind of break out into groups. we won't do that today. We won't do that today. Yeah, I don't want to just do something busy work for you guys, so that's not really fair, even though I want you guys to talk to each other. So, but we won't do that today. Does anyone, I'll just kind of let it linger here for a minute though, just hang tight for, does anyone have any questions at all? You can type them in the chat, either about exam stuff or with any content related things. Feel free to type them, or you can just kind of pipe up if you would like to. Exam stuff, yellow dig stuff, content stuff, anything. Is the exam timed, and can you save and come back to it? I do have this lined out, but I have different things, different rules for different classes. So actually, if you want to hold tight, I can tell you real fast. I have the class up right here. The exam is timed. It's 75 minutes. And I do not have it so you can save it and you can come back to it. So you have 75 minutes to take it. My compromise there, everybody, is that my compromise there is, you're more than welcome to use materials and things like that in order to take the exam. I do try to prep you guys for exam quite a bit. Take that Kahoot if you would like. Feel free to ask me questions. There are 50 questions on the exam, either multiple choice or true and false. So 75 minutes is a pretty long chunk of time to do that. In my experience, most people finish it, within 30 minutes or so. But don't rush through it. You have a lot of time, and test taking is a skill. So really discipline yourself to go back through your answers. But yeah, and you have to complete it in one sitting. So thank you for asking that, Brianna. Riley asks, will the smaller things like termites be on the test? No, they will not. But I have one more small thing to share to share with you, actually, which is riveting. So one more small thing. So class is going to go on for a couple more minutes. But let's see. Just trying to think if you have any questions, I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. I'm so sorry. Some of you are like, oh my God, but this is great. I get so excited about this stuff, and I just love sharing this all with you. Okay. I'm going to share, and this is an uplifting, cool thing. Okay. So we have termites. Okay. This is the thing that we'll end on. This is really cool. So, oh man, I can't remember the guy's name. So this comes from let me actually minimize this a bit. Let's see my notes. I guess I don't have the guy's name here, but this guy, I'll just leave it like this. This guy, so this is from a Malcolm Gladwell podcast. If you like Malcolm Gladwell, he's published a lot of really interesting books. You've probably heard of some of them, like Blink and The Tipping Point, and he has a really, really great one out called Talking to Strangers or something like that, which is fantastic. I've listened to it twice. I listen to a lot of books on Audible. But he has a podcast out called Revisionist History. Really great podcast if you're just interested in cool things. But one of the titles of his podcast was called The Tortoise and the Hare. And he makes a big argument against a lot of standardized tests, such as the LSAT, which is essentially the ACT for law school. So if you want to go to law school, you have to take the LSAT, which is, again, like the ACT for getting into law school. It's a very, 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 very hard test. You have to go super, 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 super fast. Okay. So there are 5 sections with 20 to 25 questions. The questions are very difficult to different degrees, different sorts of things. You only have 30 minutes in each, 35 minutes for each section. You have to go fast. People who take the LSAT, people who train to take the LSAT, people who train people to take the LSAT, I essentially tell them that, look, you have to move way faster than you're comfortable moving, and you're going to just hope that you do really well. And in order to get into a really high-end law school, you have to do really well. It's one of those professions. But this guy in the corner, okay, he did not get a very high score on the LSAT. He went to a pretty mid-level law school, and he is now on one of the highest, I think, appellate courts in the country. And a lot of people in the country think that he should be a nominee for the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court someday. So there's this awesome thing that Malcolm Gladwell talks about. There's this talk that Antonio Scalia did at who was one of the 9 Supreme Court justices. He did this talk at one of the more mid-level law schools, and this person in the crowd asks, who was the best clerk on your court that ever worked for you? And he said, well, the best guy that ever worked for me was this guy that I have up on the screen, even though he didn't go to one of the top law schools. And then like 30 minutes later in his speech, Scalia goes off about how, in order to really get far in law, you have to go to one of the top law schools. So Gladwell makes this really interesting argument about law schools test for hairs. They want people to be really fast. But in order to succeed in a lot of areas of law, you have to be able to go really slow and be a tortoise and really understand really complex legal arguments. And you can't do it fast. So he just kind of really talks about all these interesting dynamics and kind of juxtapositions with law. So I hope I didn't bumble through that too badly, but please, it's called Revisionist History if you want something interesting to listen to and write about on Yellow Dig. So, all right, everyone, I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. I still get you out 19 minutes early. I'll post this lecture here today, should you want to rewatch it or tell your friends about it. Important, we will not meet next week. Next week I am traveling to Louisville to do my talk, and hopefully don't get ran out of the state by a bunch of veterinarians for telling them that they're not doing the right stuff. And so I'll be recording a lecture and I'll be posting it. Okay, so I'll probably record that this weekend. I'll have it posted next week so you can watch it at your leisure. Okay, so you get a week off after taking the exam, essentially having to be here. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good day. Thanks, Connor. Bye.